Hello everyone, my name is Yana Harris and welcome back to the Chakra UI series. Today I would like to spend some time and go over a set of components that Chakra UI provides to help guide you on how to create reliable, responsive, and easy to maintain layout for your web application or marketing website. With all the tools and libraries available today for a front-end engineer, I hear oftentimes the most trivial tasks can prove to be the most challenging, and composing a robust layout for your web app can certainly fall in this category. One of the main challenges comes with the fact that you have to support multiple screen sizes and resolutions, as well as keep in mind all possible devices and medium that your user base could potentially access your web application. Today, I would like to go over a set of components that Chakra UI provides out of the box that can certainly help you create this robust, reliable, and responsive layout that you've been searching for. Don't forget, under the hood, most of those components translate to your generic HTML div tag. However, they do come with some CSS styling pre-applied, as well as providing a very smooth, intuitive, and reliable way to add additional styling directly in your markup, relying on the styling props. This is perfect for those of you that don't like writing CSS in a separate CSS or SAS file, or tend to think that it's hard to read and understand how things come together when you have to go back and forth constantly between the style definition and contextual usage of your component within the markup. Now, there are multiple layout components available in Chakra UI. We're going to be talking primarily about the core 4 components today that will really help you build your responsive, reliable, flexible, and adjustable layout. But we will mention briefly some of the ones that could also be helpful in more unique or smaller scope scenarios as well. First and foremost, obviously the most basic, the most generic component would be a box component. What the box component is really just a div. If you have experience writing generic HTML, you would definitely have experience building your markup with divs. Oftentimes, folks that are not extremely familiar with semantic HTML and HTML5 tags just resolve to using divs for every single container that they're building. Div is not very descriptive, so a screen reader wouldn't necessarily know what specific page, part, or container is responsible for if you just using div for everything. And this is generally not a very good practice to rely on divs for all of your containers. But that aside, div is obviously a workhorse of HTML, and it absolutely is present on every single website these days. You really can't build any layout without div in it. So let's take a look at the box and see what capabilities it gives us. One of the main features, and in some ways advantages of Chakra UI, is that it is following this approach in exposing a subset or the entire set of available CSS properties directly through props. And what that allows you to do as a consumer of this library is not having to write CSS separately from your business logic. This means you don't have to write CSS in a separate CSS file, use classes, give class names, and then import it into your TSX file. It also means that even if you rely on CSS and JS, you also don't have to create a style component, and you don't have to write your CSS rules in a CSS literal that later gets applied onto the component through a style prop, for example. So this can really be an easy and quick way to modify some of the key styling properties for any component. So first, let's take a look at what's available and what can be done with a box component. On the Chakra documentation website, you will find some of the basic fundamental information. You will see that the box component is essentially just gets directly imported from Chakra UI. Again, the most basic usage, and you have a few examples here in documentation that shows you how you can apply background color, width, padding, margin, and whatnot. The main suggestion is to use a shorthand that can really help you save some space and not balloon your markup significantly as you apply new styles. It also allows for pseudo props if you are trying to address a hover behavior, if you're trying to address an active or focus behavior. This is where you would be adding your styles as well in the format of a prop. A few things to keep in mind: in addition to CSS styling props, box by default gets translated into a div tag in your HTML DOM. However, if you are leaning into a more semantic HTML5 tags and trying to make your markup a little bit more readable by the screen reader and make a little bit more sense, then it is highly advised to use semantic components instead. And it doesn't mean that you have to create a different component. You can still use a box component and you can pass the tag that you would like to use through an S prop. Defining shadow in CSS can be a lengthy endeavor and it can just take up a lot of characters. So Chakra actually has a number of presets for shadow, and the way that you would use that is through using one of those predefined presets or predefined const instead of directly passing through a box shadow CSS. Let's look at my code example. Over here, I already have Chakra installed and available in my project. I already have a box component imported from within the Chakra UI React package in my node modules folder. And I'm going to simply replace the div wrapper inside of my 3 components, and I will replace it with a box. So now right away, nothing's changed. The box component, as I mentioned earlier, is simply a glorified div. So now let's start adding some styles. Go to add some padding, go to make it at 20. So now you see right away how I've added some padding around the box container. If I inspect this, I will see that a padding of 20 actually is utilizing Chakra's spacing CSS variable. So if you have never seen this CSS custom property approach before, there's essentially just one global CSS file that has all this CSS custom properties predefined. And as long as this file is imported within your project, you can use CSS custom properties anywhere in your project and directly write them. They use CSS manually, and it doesn't have to be transpiled. It's not Sass. It's not anything that needs an additional package to be understood by the browser. Browser understands this directly. And we can see that Chakra spacing 20 actually is translated into 5 REMs. But what if I meant 20 pixels? For the 20 pixel padding, I actually pass a string instead of a number. And the string just gets directly assigned to my padding property. And this is exactly what I was looking for. Now, some other things that I can apply is a background color. As you saw earlier, I can actually just assign a BG as a value for the background. Background currently is not background color, it's not background image, it's just your general background CSS role that can take anything. It can take an image, it can take a color, it can take a gradient, and we're going to go with the color at this point. So let's just go and see what BG stands for. So now if we'll inspect our box container, we will see that the background was again assigned to a CSS custom property coming from Chakra, and it is actually Chakra colors BG, and this color is getting translated into white through a hex value assignment that comes from Chakra centralized style sheet. Now that would be a good time to review Chakra color palette and see what can be done and what can be used as you are working with your Chakra components. So over here in the docs, you can find theming and colors, and this is where all the colors are available, and you will be able to find their names accordingly. So if I am looking for BG, this is where I end up on the background section. Within this background section, I see that just BG stands for white, and it actually is responsive to the changes in my theme. So if my theme is switching from light theme to the dark theme, this variable will change accordingly. This is extremely valuable and important to make sure that you don't have to hard code those color values and they are responsive to changes in your color scheme and theme. And keep in mind that the theme switch actually doesn't always have to be controlled on your website. Oftentimes we are advised to listen to the theme changes on the operating system itself. So if the user is choosing a dark theme on their operating system, the website that is striving to be accessible should actually respond to this operating system setting and switch its theme from the light theme to the dark theme accordingly. This is where it's not just up to you to have a switch, and it's not a feature that you can or cannot provide on the website. If you're trying to be accessible, if you're trying to meet a larger population and meet their needs, then that's certainly something that you have to keep in mind and play along with. So let's try background muted as an option instead. And now we are getting a slightly gray background. Well, that is super helpful because we can tell where our container is present. So I'm going to assign a border here as well. It looks like I do need to assign a border width and a border color separately. It would really help us to see this container more clearly if I added some margin. I'm going to do just that. I'm going to use one of the predefined Chakra variables instead of plain pixels in this situation. And just out of curiosity, you can see that the margin 5 actually gets translated into 1.25 REMs. Or if you want to see it in absolute pixel values, currently without scaling our font size, it actually does translate to exactly 20 pixels. And I also would like to demonstrate the S prop here as well, because I do believe it is pretty critical. I'm going to say that this is going to be my main section of the website. And as soon as I do that and we inspect the source code, we see that our div tag was actually replaced with main, which is exactly what we were looking for. You can certainly go and assign display flex to this container and it will absolutely do it. However, there's a better container to do just that. Let's take a look at the Chakra Flex container. In all honesty, it's exactly like the box container. The only difference is that by default, the display property of the Flex container is already assigned to Flex. You will see your regular Flex properties available here for styling, like direction, align, justify. You can assign order if your parent container is a Flex container as well. This will be handy. You can assign auto margin, which actually was a revelation to me. I've never used the CSS rule before. You can assign a wrap, and you see all those properties available here in the prop section, as well as spaces, row, and shrink. And if you would like to switch from display flex to display inline flex, this is available to you as well. The only difference is that instead of typing out align items in your prop, you simply type in align. Instead of typing justify content, you simply type in justify, and those are the name of the props. So if you're actually looking for align content and justify items, those will have to be typed out separately and fully because those are the least used properties and they're not as often used for Flex layout, and this is something that you will have to work a little bit harder for. So let's go ahead and switch this to Flex. So you see over here, everything that I have applied to box has been successfully applied to my Flex container just as well. So all your CSS properties that were available as props in the box container actually are also available in the Flex container. Plus, you also get the benefit of the Flex layout props here as well. So let's go ahead and add a few. For direction, we're actually going to go with column. For alignment, we're going to pick center. I will also add a gap. I personally have been relying on gap for every Flex and grid container lately. It's so amazing. I don't have to go and add individual margins around my children. I just add a gap once and then every single child has to respect it. I'll do a gap of 3, which gets translated into a chakra spacing 3, which is 0.75 REMs. So now you see exactly what I was talking about when I meant that align content is going to have to be spelled out completely, while align items can just be shorthanded to align. I'm going to say baseline. And by the way, I have a short explaining the difference between align items and align content. Feel free to check it out later after this video. Now, to make more sense of the Flexbox layout and show capabilities better, I'm going to switch from having the components that I had previously inside of my container in question to just a set of child containers that we are now going to play with and align. Currently, they're all the same sizes. They just have unique identifiers inside of them. I'm actually going to switch back from direction column to direction row. With direction row, you see that by default, we fit all of the 10 children inside a single row. However, I would like for them to wrap. So I'm going to simply type wrap, and now that makes a little bit more sense. I'm actually going to make each constituent child a little bit wider and a little bit taller. Now, 4 is an official step in our size and token system for Chakra UI, and that means every single child actually gets assigned a variable instead of a pixel value. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the height. So now the reason why I have containers of different sizes is that we might up receiving content from our server that represents different length of string or paragraph, different sizes of images, and overall variability in how our layout is going to get populated. So while we have quite a bit of flexibility in what we can do with the Flex container, let's go and take a look at the grid container next. As soon as I replace Flex container with a grid container, there's going to be some discrepancy with the type of props that are available between Flex and grid. Some of them are shared and some of them are unique. For example, the wrap and the direction props are not available in our grid container. So we're going to take those out, as well as align. So what can we do inside of our grid container? Why and when could it be beneficial? So number one is actually template columns and template rows. This is something that I use a lot every time I work with the grid. We're going to take an example from our documentation, which is a template column that is going to repeat a 3-column layout. Each of them is supposed to have exactly the same width. So now we see how different this is from the flex layout. Each component, regardless of its size, actually starts consistently at the beginning of the column, and you see how the gap between those components is very different based on the size of each child component. Another helpful element that you might like to use inside of a grid container is the grid item container. I currently have a box for each of my children, but let's go ahead and replace it with a grid item. Again, the grid item will have all the same props as the box would, and in addition to it, you can define some unique props with the grid item specifically, one of which is a row span and a col span. So if you're trying to have your child span multiple rows or multiple columns compared to every other cell within your grid, this is how you do it by importing the grid item and specifically assigning the span within the appropriate prop. I need to assign a col span of 2, but only for an item index of 8. Otherwise, it's going to be spanning a single column. Now you see we had an overflowing cell with a child item of index 8. We had to address that by specifically defining that an index 8 will actually span 2 columns. Now you see that it doesn't fit right after 7, so we have an empty cell there. It goes onto the next row and it pushes out the item with index 9 onto the 3rd column. So it does exactly what we expect it to do. And if you haven't given a chance to the grid layout yet, I highly encourage you to do so. And if you need a little bit of more documentation and know-how on how to approach grid layout, I would actually suggest to go and check out the CSS Tricks Grid Layout Guide. I swear to you, CSS Tricks has been my primary resource for anything and everything CSS for the past at least 13 years. I really love their Flexbox guide, and I used to come to it constantly, very, very often. And obviously they have a grid guide now as well. It goes very much in depth. It has some visual examples for you to really figure out and understand what's happening, what's going on. And that's going to be a lot more informational and helpful and specific than simply trying to read the Chakra UI grid item documentation. So now let's take a look at the stack container. I am honestly a little bit confused about why would I want to use stack instead of a flex container, but let's give it a try. We're going to change the grid item back to the box. We're going to replace our grid container with a stack, and by default, we get a vertical stack out of it. Let's inspect our HTML. As before, all the other props get automatically assigned. It is still a main HTML tag underneath, and it gets assigned to a class of Chakra stack. As we can see that the stack by default has a display flex, which is exactly what a flex container would have. Direction automatically to a column. We have assigned the gap to it, so that's coming from our CSS. We have also assigned the padding to it, the background, the border, and the margin. So all of those are custom to our implementation. So it looks like a stack offers some unique props like a separator prop. So I can potentially pass a stack separator through to separate my items in the stack. Let's give that a try. Let's see what happens if I remove my unique width. Now we see that every item actually takes up the entire width of the container within the stack. And it looks like stack also has a direction prop, just like a flex container would. And it looks like we can change the direction based on the breakpoint here as well, which we haven't tried in flex. So let's see if it works in both layouts. Set us a switch to a medium size of the layout. We see that it switches to a row instead of a column. Now let's switch it back to flex. With flex, we had to lose the separator because this prop is not available, but the responsive layout still works the same way it does within the stack. So honestly, I'm a little bit puzzled on why do we need stack if we already have flex. It could be semantically a little bit easier to understand and visualize for somebody who's really good with their data structures. But to me, thinking about it in terms of HTML and CSS combination really doesn't make sense and really seems more of a syntactical shooter. One of them that seems a little bit funny to me is the center container. So for those of you that are claiming that to center content within a container is the hardest part of CSS, this is a great solution for you. All you have to do is just use the right component. The way that I truly see it is this is a great container for hosting something really small, and all the examples are pointing to the same thing. You see that here we mostly see iconography. So now here I have successfully added my center container, but let me make sure that I am wrapping all my children inside of my container that I switch back to Flex. So now it makes a little bit more sense. And to be honest with you, you will be surprised how many times do I see those small instances where all we really want to do is to center a single icon or two letters inside of a square box or a circle box, which by the way are available as a shorthand within Chakra UI library. And they're just not centered enough. And you can really tell by looking at it that it's off center, and things like that can drive me crazy until I just go in and fix it myself. So all the circle does, it essentially adds a border radius, but now it's extremely easy to read this markup. So I actually think it's extremely simple, a little bit funny, but borderline genius. Really all of this semantically descriptive components are aiming to achieve a better developer experience. And readability is certainly one of the top factors in that way for me. So now a group is another interesting component in my book. The way that Chakra UI describes it is that it's a container that is aimed at grouping elements. So let's say I have two icons that I would like to group together because they identify some sort of state for a card or for this part of the UI that I'm looking at. So if I were to have two circles, one tomato, another solid, slightly different iconography, might not necessarily describe the relationship well enough. To us, clearly, these two are related because they look very much the same comparing to the rest of the children within this container. But if we look at the markup, both of these items are immediate siblings of the rest of the children within this container. So I would like to actually group them. And what better way to do it than to use a group container? So now with the group container, you can see how they're automatically grouped. So within the group, looks like the default display is going to be Flex. And it even has a column gap already applied to it, which I do not hate. And the way for me to remove this column gap is to actually use a prop called attached to physically attach them to each other. So let's give it a try. This is really genius if we are actually, instead of icons or to use buttons, this is the simplest way I've seen to create a button group without having to write a lot of styling by myself. So props to the Chakra UI team. This is a very interesting, unique example of a container component. I really like that. So now float is another one that's really, really interesting. The float is actually something that wraps around this status indicator, but still semantically and contextual actually is positioned within the overall box container that you see here in gray. So let's give it a try. I'm going to attach it to my blue button in my group to indicate that there is something happening within this control and it requires attention. So even though I attached it within the circle container itself, it actually got attached to the group that is wrapping around both of these containers. My assumption would be the way to address it would be to set position relative to the circle that's supposed to host the float. Knowing CSS basics always comes in handy. If you look at the float, you will see that the float is actually positioned absolutely. And for every element that's positioned absolutely, it's going to anchor to the closest parent that has position relative set to it. And position relative is actually not the default position value that is being set for every container. So now, as soon as I went up to the blue circle and set position relative explicitly on it, now our float gets attached to the blue circle container successfully, exactly where we wanted it. So keep that in mind. Looks like this is not something that is happening automatically. And going back to the example, yes, that's exactly what I see here as well. The box that requires the float has position relative set to it explicitly. So read the documentation, I guess, is my message. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to ask any questions below in the comment section, and I will continue to dive deeper into Chakra UI features and offerings in the future of this series. This is all for today. Thank you and goodbye.